vote, get people to the polls. We were checking in on polling locations in Multnomah County and Clark County. Of course, voting has ended. It is the day after the election, and we are starting to sort through all of the results from what we saw yesterday. So, of course, no one is surprised by the presidential election here in Oregon. Of course, Oregon going blue, voting for Joe Biden. But the thing that is making a lot of headlines around the country, even around the world this morning, is Oregon's measures voting on the decriminalization of several illegal drugs. So we wanted to take a few minutes today to dig into that a little deeper. If you are curious to learn more about Measure 109 and Measure 110, what they mean, because both of them passed, we are going to get into that. So first up, I want to talk about measure number 109. This was an Oregon state ballot measure decriminalizing psilocybin. This is the derivative found in what are often referred to as magic mushrooms, which now, thanks to the passage of this measure, can be used in the state of Oregon for medical purposes, for the treatment of things like depression and anxiety, or in instances of end of life of terminal illness care. This was a pretty solid yes vote. I will say it was the smallest margin of passage out of all the state measures. When we look at the results here, 81% of voters in Oregon coming back with the results here, 55.8%. So if you round it up, about 56% of Oregon voters who cast ballots in this election voted yes for Oregon Measure 109. So it passed by the smallest margin of the 4 state measures that we had. But it did pass. So we want to take a look at this today. Everyone's talking about Oregon legalizing shrooms. Well, there's more to it than that, right? So I want to bring in our digital enterprise reporter, Hannah Ray Lambert. She actually did a deep dive on this measure back during the campaign season. She has learned all about Measure 109, so she's going to break this down this morning. Hannah, thanks for joining me. I first want to kind of ask you just what did we see with this measure in terms of who was really, really pushing this forward? I know you spoke to some of the people who really spearheaded this movement.
So Tom and Cherie Ecker were the main petitioners here. They are psychotherapists who work in the Portland area. They do individual, couples, and family counseling. And through their work, they learned about psilocybin, the compound in what are known as magic mushrooms, and its purported use as a therapeutic aid. So they got really passionate about that. And then about 5 years ago, they launched the Oregon Psilocybin Society as an organization. And basically the whole goal of that was to help craft and then promote the measure, get the word out so that it could make it onto the ballot.
And what did they have to say about, we look at this going, sorry, let me cut back to, I had you in a box there. Lots of buttons that we're pushing as we learn how to do all of this here. What did they have to say in terms of why move this forward now? Because we have seen the FDA beginning to look into this. This has been kind of seen as one of those therapies that, maybe could be on the horizon, but a lot of people have said, no, this needs a lot more study. We need a lot more research done before we open this up to not just like the general public, but to a lot more people, the way in which this has now done. So why now?
Well, I mean, as you said, there's still a lot of studies to be done, although there are some promising ones out there, a lot of promising research, including some clinical trials that are in the early stages through the FDA. But I think Oregonians in particular have just been having a lot of changing attitudes around drugs. We saw it with medicinal marijuana and recreational marijuana. And I think it's just becoming a culture here where, proponents of psilocybin as a therapeutic aid really saw an opportunity now.
Yeah, it's interesting to see some of the changing attitudes, as you mentioned, toward this. Let's talk about who's against it, though. We saw 56% of Oregonians voting for it. There was obviously a large percentage of people who said not so fast. And there were several groups who, worked very hard to, ahead of the vote, try and get out the message that they did not think this was a good idea. So who were some of the people who were against this measure and why?
So the main opponents I found were people in the medical community. Now, Measure 109 did list lots of individual doctors and nurses and psychiatrists and people with occupations like that as supporters, but it faced broad opposition from organizations like the American Psychiatric Association, the Oregon Psychiatric Physicians Association, and the Oregon Medical Association. And a lot of that comes because of the lack of research. I mean, as we mentioned before, there have been a lot of promising studies, but nothing concrete. And I think that's why we saw a lot of doctors and doctors' organizations come out against it. I also spoke with the president of the Oregon Psychiatric Physicians Association, and she said that they're just worried a lot that the people who would be facilitating the therapeutic uses of psilocybin aren't required to be doctors. They're not required to have any sort of degree. So a lot of people in the medical community see that as sort of a risk because you're not actually a medical practitioner. And they're worried about, some of the side effects that might occur and side effects that we don't know about because of the lack of studies so far. So those were their main oppositions to it.
Interesting. Okay, so at the risk of trying to do too many things at once here, I do have our Facebook Live pulled up on my computer as well. So if you're watching, we've got several people here on the live stream. If you have questions about Measure 109 or Measure 110, we're going to get to that in a minute, decriminalization of other drugs. Leave a comment here. You can leave a question on the page. I will try my best to monitor that, and we can try and answer some questions if people have them along the way here. But of course, I'm switching back and forth between a couple different tabs while we try and take a look at all of this. So I think one of the big questions on everyone's mind now that Measure 109 has passed is, okay, what now? How does this actually get implemented? Where do we go from here? And I think really, you mentioned, Oregon's efforts to bring medical marijuana to the state, and that was back in the late 90s. So when we kind of compare and contrast how medical marijuana came to be here, how we could see things maybe roll out similarly or differently in this case, what are we looking at for the future of psilocybin?
Right. So there are a lot of similarities that people can draw here. And I think both supporters and opponents see it potentially taking a similar path. Like you said, medical marijuana was legalized in the late 90s, and then recreational followed less than 20 years later. But there are some big differences. A big one is that Measure 109, again, is not technically a medical psilocybin measure. It's a therapeutic use measure and doesn't require any sort of prescription like you needed for medicinal marijuana. It does require people to only consume psilocybin in a licensed facility, but the facilitators, again, aren't required to be doctors or have any specific degree. Another big difference is that the measure tasks the Oregon Health Authority with developing an advisory board and kind of ironing out best practices, ethics, and regulations for the therapy, all within a 2-year time frame. So that's something that when I talked with the president of the Oregon Psychiatric Physicians Association, she said she'd never heard of the Oregon Health Authority being tasked with something like this before. So that's another kind of big difference from the medicinal marijuana legalization of the late 90s.
That's interesting. So what do you think after really kind of doing a deep dive on this measure over the next couple of years? Is this a lot of hype right now over something that really may not be too big of a noticeable change for that many Oregonians? Or do you think this is going to be something that we really see kind of working into the culture of the state here in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a lot of that hype. I mean, like you said earlier, this has made national headlines because it is a first in the nation measure. There have been kind of individual cities that have legalized or at least decriminalized psilocybin use, but this is the first time a state has done it. So kind of like with medicinal and recreational marijuana, Oregon's pioneering something here, trying it out, and it's going to serve as kind of an experiment for the rest of the country. As to whether or not it, gets bigger and becomes recreationally available in the future, I mean, you can't say for sure. But it is interesting that this is happening at the same time that all drugs are being decriminalized in Oregon. So even though this measure is specifically for therapeutic use, to some degree, recreational use is not an illegal activity anymore.
Yes, and that is a great segue into the other topic that we're going to cover here, which is Oregon State Measure 110, the drug decriminalization. So really interesting thing here. This is another one that, again, is making national, global headlines this morning. Oregon voting yes on this drug decriminalization bill. This was a slightly larger yes margin here. We saw 58.8%, so 57% of Oregonians voting in favor of this measure. So this was kind of, I guess, two-pronged, if not more. There was kind of a lot of different things here rolled up in this measure. What's getting a lot of attention, first and foremost, is that drug decriminalization. So break that down for us, if you will. What does that mean for all different types of illegal drugs, street drugs? What do we now get to see in the state?
Yeah, so on the drug decriminalization side, Measure 110 reclassifies all personal drug possession to a Class E violation with a maximum $100 fine. So one of the big things to know is it doesn't affect people selling or manufacturing illegal drugs. It just impacts people who are caught with user amounts of drugs. And so they could get a $100 fine. They could get that fine waived by completing a health assessment. But there really doesn't appear to be a penalty for not paying the fine.
That's interesting. Interesting part of that too. And of course, the other big part of this bill is the reallocation of a lot of funding. So we're going to see millions of dollars from the marijuana tax that the state brings in currently. That's going to be diverted now to some different programs and is going to be used in part to create several state-run drug treatment centers. So it's interesting. I know we saw some critics of this measure make the argument that this is robbing Peter to pay Paul and moving some money around, but proponents really saying that this is a different approach. This is something that we have not seen in this country before, and we need to start trying to do something different here to address the enormous rates of drug addiction and a lack of resources and treatment for many of these people that we find it kind of intersecting in the criminal justice system in many ways. So a lot to dig into in this measure beyond the headline grabber of Oregon decriminalizes drugs. Let's talk a little bit about some of the money that's actually being moved around, because you, when you did a deep dive on this measure, really kind of looked into following the money, where things are going to go, what's being funded, what's being defunded. So what were some of the most notable things that stood out to you on that?
So this measure involves a huge amount of money, and I think that's one of the things that surprised me when I started digging into it. It doesn't create any new taxes. Like you said, the money comes from the marijuana tax revenue that the state currently collects. But Measure 110 does require at least $57 million a year in funding. So that's the minimum. But it also has a section in the bill that calls for all marijuana tax revenue in excess of $45 million a year to be directed to the fund. And I mean, as we all know, the marijuana fund collected way more money than legislators initially anticipated. People bought way more recreational marijuana than they planned for. So there is actually a lot of tax revenue in excess of that $45 million a year mark. So when I talked with opponents, they said it's actually estimated to bring in closer to $100 million a year, when I talked to supporters, they said it's expected to bring in closer to $100 million a year. So that's close to double just what it's required to fund.
Yeah.
And those millions of dollars are currently earmarked for other priorities. So it's taking money from things like the school fund, the state committee that was tasked with kind of doing a financial impact analysis. They estimate it'll redistribute about $73 million from the state school fund. It'll also take some money from cities and counties and state police. So there is kind of a drawback to moving all this money around.
Yeah, it's certainly I think a tough call when you look at what things would be funded, where we need to take some money away. But again, this was an approach that a lot of people who were in support of this measure felt needed to be done. I know we talked this morning on Coin News AM Extra on our morning show on the CW with Janie Gullickson. She's the executive director of the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon, a woman who has been at the forefront of pushing this measure forward. I know, Hannah Ray, you talked to her as well, and she comes to this from a very personal place of having dealt with addiction personally and seen how that affected her life and her family, and really how she felt that the treatment she got finally came in jail when she was behind bars, and wondered why some of these resources were not available to her and others in another format. So, what are some of the things that she and others who pushed this measure forward really hope to achieve with this measure?
I mean, I think you kind of alluded to it there. People are just tired of what they see as a cycle of people who struggle with addiction cycling in and out of jail and never actually getting treated for the root problem. You mentioned Janie, who went to jail numerous times. She struggled with addiction for 22 years, and it wasn't until she landed in prison that she finally got treatment. And I think a lot of people are just frustrated with that. People who have family members who struggle with addiction are frustrated with that. And they see this as an opportunity to, instead of just putting someone behind bars and giving them a criminal record, to actually get them treatment. Because, I mean, getting a criminal record can impact your life in so many other ways too. It can make it harder to get a job, to get housing. So supporters of Measure 110 really see this as a new way to approach the problem that focuses on treatment instead of punishment.
Yeah, it's an argument that many have made, especially this year, to say what we have been doing in the state of Oregon as a country for decades doesn't seem to necessarily be working. But of course, you have opponents. I know I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was the Washington County District Attorney was not in favor of this measure and had spoken out saying, let us reform the current system and make tweaks to some of the stuff that we have in place. And I think one of the other areas that it really kind of became a topic of conversation this year was when you look at the intersectionality of race relations with the criminalization and drug use and how people wind up behind bars, and it can spiral over some of these smaller drug crimes. So that was one of the things that they looked at in this measure, and that was presented to voters, right, was the racial impact of a lot of these arrests for drug possession.
Exactly. So earlier this year, state lawmakers did something a little unusual for them, which was requesting a racial impact analysis of the bill. So the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission did that racial impact analysis, and the results appeared in the voters pamphlet for everyone to look at. They estimated that racial disparities for misdemeanor and felony drug possession convictions would be narrowed significantly, assuming the measure passed. So it would bring down, obviously, conviction rates for everybody, but would also kind of close the gap between different ethnicities.
What impact do you think that had, especially this year, as we've seen these ongoing demonstrations in Portland nightly, as there's been so much conversation over racial unrest in this country? Having that study, having that focus a part of the information available to voters for this measure, do you think that Oregon voters had some changing attitudes because of the things we've seen throughout 2020 that maybe tipped the scales on this one?
I definitely don't think it hurt the measure. Obviously, this is a huge issue that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, especially in 2020. We've seen all these racial disparities in the criminal justice system, and a lot of those are very, very apparent within drug convictions. So I think it definitely helped the measure. To what degree, it's hard to say. There are all those other factors, like people just knowing more people who struggle with addiction, and it seems to kind of be more out in the open than it maybe has in the past. So I think the stigma has definitely decreased. And there's just a lot of factors that played into Oregon's support of Measure 110.
It's certainly a discussion that I think people are going to continue to have as we see how this measure actually rolls out. But the one thing that I do want to reiterate for anyone who's watching, or for anyone who has friends and family out of the state who are texting and calling them today wondering what is going on in Oregon, if they're only seeing those headlines, real quick, Hannah Ray, just walk me through again the decriminalization part of this measure. It's not a free-for-all on all illegal drugs. What is actually being decriminalized in this measure?
Exactly. You're not going to be able to go to the store and buy heroin under this measure. It just takes away the harsh prison sentences or jail sentences, basically making it so that the only punishment is a possible $100 fine. And even that, you can't be sent to jail if you don't pay it. So decriminalizing personal user amounts of drugs doesn't affect people selling it or manufacturing drugs.
Yeah, of course, with the hope there that it will encourage many more people into treatment and to connect with the resources that can get them out of that devastating cycle of addiction and into recovery. Well, Hannah Ray, we appreciate you taking the time to chat with us about both of these today. For anyone who still wants to learn more, I know you did a deep dive into these measures and some of the other ballot measures that were passed. The entire Coin Digital team has been really hard at work over the last couple weeks here, really breaking down the money, the behind the scenes, the all different angles on all of these ballot measures. So for anyone who's watching us right now, you can go to coin.com and read up on both of these, on everything else that was on ballots in Oregon and Washington. And we will continue updating people as we go throughout the day. Of course, keeping an eye on the presidential race around the country as well. Hannah Ray, before I let you go, I'm curious, what was maybe just like one of the things here that you have been following overnight in all of the elections that either surprised you or that you wish more people were paying attention to? What's your plug for the website right now?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. I mean, one of the things that I've been checking the most often on our website is on the main election results page. You can see the state presidential race map, and that has just been fascinating to look at. I mean, last night it was a little bit more active, obviously, but still going on there and just seeing which state is leading Republican, which state is leading Democrat, how the votes break down by county has been anxiety inducing a little bit, but also really interesting to go and refresh that a lot. So that's the thing that I've been following all night.
Yeah, anxiety inducing. I will agree with you there. But Hannah Ray, I put you on the spot with that one. I appreciate you being a good sport, and thank you again for chatting with me this morning. We'll see you again virtually here soon. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, sure. All right, so mentioning the Electoral College map there, coming up in just a few minutes, Coin 6 News at noon. We'll be back on the air on CBS with the very latest from around the country in the presidential race as we watch some of those key battleground states, the votes continuing to be counted in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all of that changing by the minute. So turn on the TV here in just a couple of minutes and we'll have the latest update for you there. And we'll be back on the air for Coin 6 News at 4 p.m. Of course, you can go to coin.com anytime or your Coin 6 mobile app to see the map that Hannah Ray was talking about there. Get the very latest voting results from all of your state and local races here for Oregon and Washington, and to stay up to date along the way as the rest of this week plays out. For now, we're going to end this live stream. I will see you back here in the podcast studio sometime soon. Happy day after elections, everyone.